Hi, I'm Dr. Catherine Clements, the Ecology and Natural Resources Educator at University of Florida IFAS Extension, Sarasota County. And I'm coming to you today virtually from my home office to talk about the LIFE program, or Learning in Florida's Environment. So now we're going to do marine invertebrate classification. This lab has a lot of big words in it. So just stick with me and we're going to learn some really interesting scientific words and information in this lab. Here we go. So first we're going to talk about taxonomy. See if you can say that word with me, taxonomy. Taxonomy is a method of classifying or organizing living organisms. Anything that is alive is classified through this system called taxonomy. All living organisms are classified based on shared characteristics. So it's like if you had a bunch of toys and you grouped all the red toys into one pile, all the yellow toys into another pile, and all the blue toys into yet another pile. You would be grouping your toys based on a shared color characteristic, and you would be a toy taxonomist. Or maybe you'd classify or group your toys together based on whether they have wheels or not. That's a different shared characteristic. So this is how scientists classify living organisms. They look at all the different characteristics of that organism, like its body parts or how it breathes or how it reproduces, and then scientists will group living organisms based on those shared characteristics, and this helps scientists understand, organize, and even communicate about life. So today we're going to talk about animals. Animals are in the kingdom Animalia. Animals can be classified or organized based on whether or not they have a backbone or a spine made up of vertebrae. So animals that have a backbone are called what? You're right, they're called vertebrates. And animals that don't have a backbone are called invertebrates. You've probably learned all about vertebrates. There are 5 classes of vertebrates: fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And you know all about them. You know that fish have shared characteristics which are very different from the characteristics that make a bird or that make a mammal a mammal. But we are going to focus on marine invertebrates for our lab, or animals without backbones that live in saltwater. You may not know these. So let me say these words for you because they're sort of fun to say. They're pretty big words, and they are different groups or phylum of marine invertebrates. So starting with the first one in green, that is Cnidaria. That's my favorite one. It doesn't even sound like it's spelled. You don't say the C. Let's say it together again, Cnidarian. We're going to learn what characteristics a cnidaria has in just a moment. The next word is echinoderm. See if you can say that one with me, echinoderm. Next on the list is arthropoda. You might already know about arthropods because insects and spiders are also arthropods that live on land. But we have very interesting arthropods that live in the water too. The next one is mollusca. And then our last group is porifera. That's another fun word to say. See if you can say it, porifera. And there's even more phylum of marine invertebrates, but these are the 5 that we're going to talk about now. All right, so let's learn a little bit more about these 5 phyla or categories of marine invertebrates. We'll start with arthropoda on the top of our list. Arthropods are actually 75% of all the animals in the world. There's lots of different arthropods on land and in the water, and they have these similar characteristics. They have jointed legs, segmented bodies, and their skeleton is sort of on the outside of their body. It's called an exoskeleton. And arthropods molt or shed their exoskeletons as they grow. They also have something called bilateral symmetry, and I'll explain that in a minute. Examples of marine invertebrate arthropods are animals like crabs and lobsters and horseshoe crabs, and then of course on land, insects and spiders. The next phyla on our list is Porifera. And Porifera are pretty easy to learn about because they are the simplest of all animals. They are the sponges. Sponges attach to a surface like a rock. They don't just float around in the water. And they also filter feed. So they just let the water move through them, and that's how they get their food. They don't even have a head or a nervous system, and they don't have any symmetry, which once again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So sponges, or the Porifera, are very, very simple invertebrates. All right, the next one on the list is my favorite, Cnidaria. Cnidaria have tentacles around their mouth with stinging cells that inject toxins. So not only do they have a cool sounding name, they also are predators that inject their prey like fish with toxins. Cnidaria also breathe through their skin, and they have what we call radial symmetry. Examples of Cnidaria are jellyfish, sea anemones, and coral. Next on our list is echinoderms. Echinoderms also have radial symmetry, just like Cnidaria. So when you are a scientist, you can't always depend on one characteristic to classify an organism because sometimes there's overlap between the different groups. So you have to observe all the different characteristics of an organism to decide which phylum it fits into. And even though echinoderms have radial symmetry like Cnidaria, it's usually in 5. And we're going to see an example of that in a minute. Echinoderms also have many tube feet, and they do not have stinging cells or tentacles. Some examples of echinoderms are sea stars. You might call them starfish, but they aren't fish, so marine biologists call them sea stars. Sea urchins and sea cucumbers are also examples of echinoderms. All right, our last group on the list before we look at some cool pictures are mollusca. Mollusks are an interesting group because they have some things that are similar, but they also have a lot of differences. Mollusks have a squishy body. They have bilateral symmetry, and some of them have one shell, but some of them have 2 shells, and guess what? Some of them don't even have a shell. Some of them crawl around on a muscular foot like a snail, and some even have tentacles coming out of their heads. Wow, that's a lot of differences. So examples in phylum Mollusca are clams and oysters. Those are the ones with 2 shells. Squid and octopus do not have shells. They are the mollusks that have tentacles from their head. So we are going to review these examples in a minute, but let's first talk about symmetry. Symmetry means sameness or having equal parts. On the left hand of your slide, you see a beetle. Beetles have bilateral symmetry. Human beings also have bilateral symmetry. If you could draw a line from our head right down our bodies in between our feet to the floor, our right side pretty much looks exactly like our left side. Bi means 2 and lateral means side. So bilateral symmetry is an animal that has 2 equal sides that look pretty much the same, just like the beetle on your slide. An example of radial symmetry is the sea anemone in the middle of your slide. With radial symmetry, you can imagine drawing a circle around the animal and then draw radii or lines from the center of the circle to the outside of the circle. And that cuts the animal into pieces of a pie, and all the pieces of the pie would look the same if the animal has radial symmetry. And then on the right hand of your slide, there's our sponge. And our sponge has no symmetry at all because it's just so simple. There are no two pieces of the sponge that look the same, so it doesn't have bilateral symmetry, and you can't even draw a circle around it and cut it into pieces of a pie and have those pieces look the same. So our sponge has no symmetry or asymmetry. All right, now we're going to see some cool pictures and we're going to try to figure out what these things are. On this slide, we have a lobster and a crab. They belong to the same group or phylum. So let's try to figure out together which phylum these two organisms belong to by observing their characteristics. When I look at them, I see that they have jointed legs. And the lobster has a segmented body. It's hard to see the crab having a segmented body, but if you could look at the underside of the crab shell, you would see that crabs have segmented bodies also. And the crab and lobster both have an exoskeleton. We call it a shell, but it's actually an exoskeleton that molts as they grow. Sometimes you might even find an empty crab exoskeleton on the beach. So what group do these belong to? You're right, they are arthropods. So look at this. This is a sponge from Venice Beach right here in Sarasota County. And look, there's no symmetry. You can't draw a line through the sponge and get two equal sides. You can't draw a circle around it and divide it into equal pieces of a pie. This sponge was washed up on the beach, but when it was alive, it would have been attached to a rock or some other structure in the water, and the water would just flow through the sponge, and that's how it would have gotten food. So, do you remember the name for the group that our sponge belongs to? You're right again, Porifera. Sponges belong to phylum Porifera, the simplest of all. All right, next up, look at these. These are my favorite. So on the left-hand side, you have a really cool moon jelly, a type of jellyfish. And on the right-hand side, you have a sea anemone. Both of these organisms belong to the phylum that have tentacles around their mouths that have stinging cells that inject toxins into their prey, like little fish that they eat. They also breathe through their skin and have radial symmetry, the one where you can draw a circle around and cut them into different pieces that all look the same. Do you remember that fun word that I love to say? These belong to phylum Cnidaria. These are all Cnidaria. I also have another example of Cnidaria. These are coral polyps. Coral reefs are actually the calcium skeleton of all of these little living animals called coral polyps. So the polyps are the individual animals that build that calcium shell that ends up making the reef. You can see in the top picture, they look a lot like miniature sea anemones, but each of those are little polyps, and each of these little animals has stinging cells. So coral also belong to phylum Cnidaria. All right, in this group, you can really imagine the radial symmetry. We have sea urchins on the right that are alive and have their spines and tube feet still. But the sea urchin in the bottom middle of your screen is no longer alive and has lost all of its little pokey spines and tube feet. You can see where the spines and feet would have attached to its living body. And that creates a pattern where you can really observe how you could draw a circle around the sea urchin and make 5 equal pieces of a pie. You can see those 5 separate areas in that pattern. So our sea urchins, just like the sea stars in the photo on top, have radial symmetry. Sea stars also have many tube feet that help them move around. Sand dollars also belong to the same group. Can anyone guess which phylum these all belong to? Echinoderms, you guessed it. So we've got one last group to talk about. This group is complicated because all organisms in this phylum have a soft, squishy body and bilateral symmetry, but they also have a lot of different characteristics. This slide shows us examples of organisms with shells. The one on the left is a coquina from Venice Beach. These are the tiny shells you sometimes find at the beach. I've just made it look really big on the slide. Coquinas are just like clams and oysters. They have two shells and we call them bivalves. Bi means two. And inside those shells is a very soft, squishy body. They also have bilateral symmetry. And then on the right-hand side, you have a picture of what we call a gastropod, which is an organism with a soft, squishy body and a muscular foot so it can move across the ocean. And it is protected by a single shell. Can you remember what these organisms belong in? These organisms are part of phylum Mollusca, or mollusks. But there are more mollusks. Look at these. Octopus and squid are also mollusks. They have a soft, squishy body, a head, and 8 or more legs that are attached to their head. And the last on the picture is a sea slug. That is actually a gastropod because it has a strong muscular foot, but it doesn't have a shell like the gastropod on the slide before. So mollusks are a very complicated phylum with a soft, squishy body in common, but lots of different characteristics.
We have learned a lot of exciting new science words together today. Words like cnidaria and echinoderm. And we have learned how scientists called taxonomists classify living organisms based on shared characteristics. So now it's time for you to put all of this into practice. Here's our activity for this episode of Life. You can gather together anything you have at home or at school, and we are going to sort them according to shared characteristics. You might have a bunch of pens and pencils, you might have a bunch of toys, or you might even have some candy. Anything that you have a group of that you can practice sorting according to shared characteristics. I'm going to show you my example. Here's a picture of shells that I collected at the beach. These are shells from marine invertebrates, but they are no longer living. You never want to take a living shell or living invertebrate from the beach. So I'm going to take all of my shells and I'm going to decide how I want to classify them. I'm going to be a taxonomist. So first, I think I will classify my shells based on the shared characteristic of size. So in this picture, in the middle, you see a quarter. So what I did is on the left-hand side of the picture, I sorted all the shells that were the size of a quarter or smaller. And then on the right-hand side of the picture, you'll see all the shells that are larger than a quarter. So this is one shared characteristic that I sorted or classified my shells into. I'm going to show you one more example. Here's another picture, and this picture, I sorted my shells based on shape. On the left-hand side of the picture, you will see all the shells that are circular or oval. They're pretty round. But on the right-hand side, I sorted all the shells that have a spiral shape. So on the left, you have circular oval shells, and on the right, you have spiral shells. So this is just one example of how you can take everyday items that you have at home or at school and start to sort them like a taxonomist would. Maybe you sort by size, maybe you sort by shape, maybe even you sort by color or how you would use the item. So many different ways to have fun with this activity. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Life, Learning in Florida's Environment, and I look forward to seeing you at other episodes. Thank you.